The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I kept the log, the way I had started keeping everything by then. Dates, times, exact words. The particular quality of silence that follows a sentence that should never have been spoken out loud. I was standing in the kitchen of the apartment Marcus and I had been renting in Naperville, Illinois, still wearing the ring he had placed on my finger less than 2 hours before, and I was calling my mother to share the best news of my adult life. The afternoon light was coming in flat and gold through the window above the sink. I remember the smell of the coffee I had just made, the warmth of the mug between my palms, the specific tenderness of that moment, the way joy can make a person feel physically warm from the inside. She picked up on the third ring. I could hear background noise, something light and ambient, instrumental music the kind they play in hotel lobbies or upscale waiting rooms. "Mom," I said, "I have something to tell you. He proposed this morning. We're engaged." There was a pause. Not the pause of someone overcome, not the pause of a mother pressing her hand to her chest because her daughter has just told her something wonderful. It was the pause of someone recalibrating. And then she said, "Oh, that's sweet." And then, without taking a breath, she said, "I can't really talk right now, honey. Diane and I are at that spa over in Hinsdale, the one she's been trying to get into for months. We're about to go in for our appointments. Can I call you later? Diane is my younger sister. She was 31 years old at the time. My mother was 63. I said, "Sure, of course. Enjoy your appointment." And she hung up. I stood there holding the mug with both hands, watching the light on the kitchen floor. The ring on my left hand caught it and scattered small pieces of brightness across the wall. I took a sip of coffee. I set the mug down. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, you've been here before. Not exactly here, not with this specific piece of news in your chest, but in this place where you reach toward her and she is simply not there. You've been here many times. You just kept forgetting. That was November 7th. Marcus and I were married the following June at a small outdoor ceremony in Geneva, Illinois. 38 people, white garden chairs on a grass lawn that smelled like cut flowers and early summer. My mother attended. She wore a dress I had never seen before, something expensive and elaborate, the kind of garment that announces its own price. She cried during the vows, which I found strange because she had not cried when I called her. She hugged me afterward and told me I was beautiful and that she was so happy for me. She ate the salmon and drank 3 glasses of champagne and danced with my Uncle Richard and left at 9 in the evening because she had a drive ahead of her. My sister Diane was her +1. They left together in my mother's car. I watched the taillights disappear and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not quite relief, not quite sadness. Something closer to confirmation. Something like the gentle closing of a door I had held open for a very long time. To understand what happened 11 months after that wedding, I have to take you back further. Not because I need you to pity me. I don't. I need you to understand the pattern. Because without the pattern, what my mother did when she showed up at our door asking for money looks like a misunderstanding. And it was not a misunderstanding. It was the logical conclusion of a dynamic she had been practicing her entire life, with me as her preferred participant. My name is Caroline Reyes. I am 39 years old now. When Marcus proposed, I was 36. I had spent the prior 12 years working in healthcare administration, specifically in hospital billing and compliance. And for the last 4 of those years, I had been a senior director at a regional hospital system outside of Chicago. I made good money. I was precise and organized, and I had a reputation for being thorough in ways that occasionally made people uncomfortable. I had fought for that career with the kind of focus that only comes from knowing that no one is going to hand you anything, because I had learned that lesson young and learned it close to home. My father left when I was 9 and Diane was 6. He remarried within 2 years and moved to Phoenix and sent birthday cards with $20 bills in them until I was about 14. And then even that stopped. My mother raised us alone, which she will tell you with a particular emphasis that she has never stopped refining because the story of her sacrifice is something she has been polishing for 3 decades. She worked as a dental office manager, and she was competent and organized, and she made enough to keep the house in Downers Grove and put food on the table, and I do not discount that. I know what that cost her, but somewhere along the way, the sacrifice stopped being something she had done for us and became something she was owed in return, and the currency she expected was not gratitude or closeness or love. It was access. Access to our time, our decisions, our finances, and eventually, our stability. Diane had always been easier for her in that regard. 2 years younger than me, softer in certain ways, more willing to absorb our mother's needs without pushback. They were close in the way that requires one person to consistently center the other, and Diane was that person for my mother from a very young age. I was the one who asked questions. I was the one who noticed when the math didn't add up and said so. My mother had a word for that. Difficult. She used it affectionately sometimes, the way people do when they want the label to feel like a compliment while still meaning exactly what it says. By the time I was in my late 20s and had built my own professional life in a city where I had moved deliberately, not in defiance, just in the direction of my own future, my mother had developed a specific approach to our relationship. She was warm when she needed something and distant when she didn't. She called on her schedule, which was to say she called when something was happening in her world that required my attention or my response. She forgot important things in my life with a consistency that was too precise to be accidental and too frequent to be forgiven as simple absent-mindedness. She forgot the date of a presentation I had been preparing for 6 months. She forgot to mention to extended family that I had been promoted. She came to visit exactly once in 4 years, and that visit lasted 3 days. And on the second day, she told me that I had always been the strong one, and that she never worried about me the way she worried about Diane. And she meant this as a compliment, and I received it as the structural truth it actually was. She worried about Diane because Diane needed her, and she did not worry about me because I had committed the sin of not needing her in the same visible, constant way. And then I met Marcus. Marcus Reyes. He is Cuban-American. His family is from Miami. He had been in the Chicago area for 8 years when we met, working as a civil engineer for a firm that specialized in infrastructure contracts with the state. Marcus was the most genuinely calm person I had ever been close to. Not passive, not indifferent. Calm in the way that comes from having done a lot of internal work and still choosing it every day. He was 42 when we got engaged. He had been briefly married in his early 30s and divorced without children and without bitterness, and he had a quality I did not fully have words for at the time, but have since come to call structural honesty. He told the truth in situations where most people would choose the comfortable version. He noticed things. He remembered what people said and referenced it later. He had a specific, measured response to dishonesty that I would come to understand much better in the months following our wedding. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. During those 2 years, my mother met him twice. Both times at my instigation, both times with advanced planning and logistics I handled entirely. The first meeting was dinner at a restaurant in Oak Park where I had made a reservation 3 weeks ahead. My mother was 40 minutes late. She did not apologize. She spoke mostly to Marcus for the first 20 minutes. Charming, focused, performing warmth with a precision that I recognized from a lifetime of watching her workrooms. And then for the rest of the meal, she spoke mostly about Diane's new apartment in Elmhurst and a health issue her friend Patricia had been dealing with. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet for a while, and then he said, "She's very good at being in a room." I knew exactly what he meant. The second meeting was a Sunday brunch at our apartment, 9 months before the proposal. My mother arrived on time, ate everything on the table, told Marcus 3 different versions of the same story about her years as a single mother, and left with 2 containers of leftover pasta I'd offered before she even thought to ask. On the way out, she told me privately, while Marcus was washing dishes, that she was glad I'd found someone who seemed stable. Stable. As if the primary qualification for a partner was structural soundness rather than something as inconvenient as love. When Marcus proposed on a Saturday morning in November in our kitchen, with coffee still in the pot and neither of us dressed yet, it was not a production. It was a conversation that had been building for months, a natural conclusion to a long honesty about what we both wanted, and when he put the ring on my finger, it felt like the quietest, most certain thing I had ever experienced. I sat there looking at it for a long moment, and then I thought of my mother, and I picked up my phone and called her, because that is what daughters do. Or try to. You already know how that call went. What you don't know yet is that by the time she showed up at our door 11 months after the wedding, Marcus had been quietly building a file on her for almost as long as I had known him. Not because he was suspicious by nature, not because he started from a place of hostility toward my family. He built the file because he is the kind of person who documents the things that matter, and my mother had given him ample material. The file began, technically, with the restaurant dinner. He had written down the time she arrived, 40 minutes late, and the fact that she did not apologize. He noted the conversation distribution across the meal. He noted the moment she pivoted from engaging with me to engaging with him, the exact transition, what she had been saying, what caused the shift. He did this with the same methodical habit he applied to everything in his professional life, not because he was building a case, but because he is simply the kind of person who writes things down. Over the following months, as our wedding approached, the entries grew. There was the moment she called me 3 weeks before the ceremony to ask whether her hotel room was being covered. Not whether we needed help, not whether there was anything she could contribute, whether her room was covered. Marcus was sitting across from me when I took that call, and I watched him pick up his notepad without saying anything and write something I could not see from where I was sitting. I found out later that he had written, asked about hotel cost, no offer to contribute, no acknowledgement of wedding expenses. There was the day she called and spoke to me for 40 minutes about a renovation she was thinking about doing to the Downers Grove house, specifically whether she should redo the kitchen or the master bathroom. And at the end of that conversation, as a kind of afterthought, asked how the wedding planning was going. I said fine. She said, good. I know you have it under control. You always do. There was the fact that she did not offer to help with any portion of the wedding costs. Marcus and I paid for everything ourselves. $16,000, not an extravagant number, but not nothing. And my mother attended as a guest, which was fine, which was her right, except that she later described the wedding to her friends in a way that positioned her as a central organizer. Marcus's cousin overheard this at the reception. He mentioned it to Marcus later. Marcus wrote it down. And then there was Diane. Diane had known about the spa appointment, obviously. She had been there. She had also known that I was calling my mother that day, because we had texted the night before. Diane and I had mentioned casually that Marcus and I were going to have a conversation the next morning, and I was a little nervous. I had not told her explicitly what the conversation was about, but Diane is not a slow reader of situations. She knew, and she had gone anyway, to the spa, with our mother, and when she hugged me at the wedding, she said, "You look so happy," and she meant it genuinely, I believe, because Diane does not have malice in her the way my mother sometimes does. But she had a habit that I had watched my entire life, which was the habit of standing very close to my mother and very slightly apart from me, always, in every situation where a choice had to be made about proximity. Not from cruelty, from alignment. My mother's center of gravity was strong, and Diane had orbited it so long she no longer noticed the pull. I loved my sister. I still love my sister. But by the time of the wedding, I had started to understand that loving someone and trusting them are not the same thing, and that the gap between those two things matters enormously when there is a third person who knows how to use that gap. Marcus and I came back from our honeymoon, 9 days in Portugal, Lisbon, and then the Alentejo, the best 9 days of my adult life, and settled into our house. We had bought the house 4 months before the wedding, a 1970s brick colonial in Wheaton, Illinois, 2,400 square feet, on a street with old trees and quiet traffic. Marcus put 22% down. My name was on the deed. We had a joint account for household expenses and maintained our individual accounts for personal spending, an arrangement we had discussed specifically and in detail before we merged any finances at all. We also had a shared investment account that Marcus managed, a modest but real portfolio that he had been building for years and that I had contributed to in the months before the wedding. We were not wealthy in any meaningful public sense of that word. We were two working professionals who had saved carefully and were now in a stable position. But from the outside, or from the particular angle my mother was using to look at us, I suppose it looked like something she had decided to translate into an opportunity. The call came in April. We had been married for 10 months. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 7, and I was sitting at the kitchen table finishing a report I had brought home from work when my phone rang. It was my mother. She was warm immediately, which I had learned to register as information rather than comfort. She asked about Marcus, asked about the house, asked whether we had done anything with the backyard yet. We talked for about 10 minutes, or rather, she talked and I listened and contributed enough to maintain the shape of a conversation. And then she said, "I've been thinking about a trip." I asked where. She said she had been wanting to go to Tuscany for years. She and her friend Patricia had talked about it, but Patricia's knees weren't good and she wasn't sure she could manage the walking, and Diane had just started a new job and couldn't take the time, and she was thinking about just going on her own. But the cost of it was more than she had expected, especially with the euro the way it was. She mentioned a specific itinerary she had looked at: 14 days, Florence and Siena, and a wine region I don't remember. And she mentioned, with the precision of someone who had already done the math, that it came to just under $9,000 including the flights. I said, "That sounds beautiful, Mom." She said, "I was hoping you and Marcus might be able to help with some of it, since you're doing so well now." Since you're doing so well now. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I have sat with it many times. Since you're doing so well now. As if my financial stability were a weather event that had occurred near me rather than a decade of deliberate work I had done. As if the appropriate response to my own security was to make it available to her. As if she was simply identifying a resource and noting its proximity. I told her I would need to talk to Marcus. She said, "Of course. Take your time. No pressure." She asked again about the backyard, whether we were thinking of putting in a garden. And then she said goodnight, and we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then I walked to the living room where Marcus was reading, and I sat down across from him, and I told him what she had said. All of it, exactly, including the specific dollar amount and the phrase she had used. "Since you're doing so well now." He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know yet. I want to think about it." He nodded. Then he got up and went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where he kept his papers, and he opened the bottom drawer, and he took out a manila folder. He set it on the desk without opening it, and he said, "When you're ready to talk about it, this might be useful." And he went back to his chair. I looked at the folder. I did not open it that night. I started to think more carefully about the pattern in the days that followed. Not because I was surprised exactly, but because something about the $9,000 request had clarified things in a way that the previous years of smaller omissions had not managed to. The spa appointment, the hotel room question, the 40-minute conversation about kitchen renovations, my mother calling to tell me about Diane's promotion, but never mentioning mine to the same people, the way she had described the wedding to her friends, the way she said, "Since you're doing so well now," as if my life were a dividend she had earned the right to collect. I thought about Diane, and about the particular geography of that family dynamic. Diane, who had been at the spa. Diane, who had never once said, "Mom." That was the wrong thing to do about Caroline's engagement call. Diane, who stood just close enough to my mother that every piece of information that moved through me eventually traveled outward in that direction. I did not think Diane was malicious. I thought she was loyal to the wrong person and too comfortable to question it, which in the end produces the same result as malice, even if the interior experience is different. I thought about what it would mean to give my mother $9,000, not whether we could afford it. We could, technically, in the sense that the money existed, but what it would mean, what it would teach her, what it would confirm about who she believed I was and what she believed she was owed. I thought about the phone call on November 7th and the 4 minutes and 12 seconds and the spa appointment and the way she had said, "Oh, that's sweet." I thought about all of it for 5 days. And then I told Marcus I was ready to talk. He opened the folder on the kitchen table between us. He had been keeping records since the restaurant dinner in Oak Park, 2.5 years. The folder contained 37 pages, which sounds excessive until you understand that most of them were short. A date, a brief description, sometimes a direct quote when he could remember the exact phrasing. He had organized it chronologically, and he walked me through it section by section, not with any drama, just in the same measured tone he uses when he is presenting information he wants to make sure is understood clearly. The restaurant dinner, the brunch, the pre-wedding calls, specifically the hotel room conversation and its surrounding context, the wedding itself, the time she arrived, the time she left, the conversation his cousin had overheard about her role in the planning, the calls during our first months of marriage, their frequency and content, the gradual progression from social contact toward financial inquiry. He had noted the timing of each call, when they had occurred relative to other events in our lives, when there had been coverage in our family group chat about something good happening for us professionally, how close those posts were to the calls in which my mother asked for something. He had also, without telling me, called his own cousin who had been at the wedding, his cousin Elena, who is a family law paralegal in Miami, and described the pattern to her in broad terms. Elena had given him a list of things to document if things ever escalated. He had been following the list. I sat with all of this for a long time. I did not feel ambushed. I felt, in a very specific and strange way, understood. Because everything in that folder was true, and everything in that folder was something I had known, and then not let myself know, the way you do with things that are too close to look at directly. Having it written down, in order, with dates, made it impossible to soften. It was what it was. She was who she was. We talked for 2 hours that night. At the end of it, we had made a decision. We would not send money to Tuscany. And when she came, because we both understood that she would come, that a phone request declined would eventually produce a physical visit. We would be ready. She called back 6 days later. I said that Marcus and I had discussed it, and we weren't in a position to contribute to the trip. I kept my voice entirely neutral. She said she understood, of course. No pressure. She would figure something else out. She hung up in 3 minutes. The warmth she had started the call with had evaporated cleanly before the second minute. She arrived at our door on a Saturday in early May, 5 weeks after that call. She had driven herself from Downers Grove 40 minutes, and she had not called ahead. She rang the doorbell at 11 in the morning. She was dressed carefully, which I noticed immediately, in a pale blue blazer and pressed slacks and the kind of jewelry she wore when she wanted to be received as someone who had made an effort. She was carrying a small bakery box from a place I recognized from Elmhurst, which meant she had planned the route to include a stop, which meant the whole thing had been orchestrated to look spontaneous. Marcus opened the door because I had heard the car pull up and I had walked to the kitchen and stayed there. I heard him greet her. I heard her say, "I was just in the area and thought I'd stop by," and I heard the particular warmth he extended to her. Genuine, measured, giving nothing away. He called me from the kitchen doorway. I came out. I hugged her. She smelled of that same perfume she had worn my entire life, something floral and a little sweet. She handed me the bakery box. I thanked her. We sat down in the living room. She spent the first 20 minutes telling us about Diane, Diane's new job, a position at a marketing firm in the city, and how well Diane was adjusting, and how she had helped Diane find an apartment and negotiate the rent, and how proud she was of her. I listened. Marcus listened. He had made coffee before she arrived, and he poured cups and set them on the table and sat across from her with the kind of attentiveness that looks exactly like relaxed interest and is actually something else entirely. Then she shifted. It was the same shift I had watched at the restaurant in Oak Park, the same transition point, the same subtle recalibration. And she said, "I've been thinking more about that trip." And she said, "I talked to a travel agent, and it turns out I could do a shorter version, just 10 days, for closer to 7,000. And she looked at me, then at Marcus, and she said, "I know you said you couldn't do the whole amount, and I completely understand. I would never want to put pressure on you, but if you could do even 3,000, that would make such a difference. Since you're both doing so well now." There it was again. Since you're doing so well now. The same phrase. The same framing. Marcus set his coffee cup down on the table. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Just 1 second." And he stood up and walked to the desk in the corner, and he came back with the manila folder. He set it on the coffee table between them. He did not open it yet. My mother looked at it, then at him, then at me. Her expression went through several small adjustments in the space of about 2 seconds. Curiosity, uncertainty, something that might have been the first edge of something colder. Marcus said, "Carol, I want to have an honest conversation with you, and I want to be respectful while we do it. Can we do that?" She said, "Of course." He opened the folder. He turned the first page to face her. He said, "This is a record I've been keeping of the interactions between you and Caroline, and between the two of us, since we've been together. Not because I was looking for anything. because I pay attention to things, and I write them down." She looked at the page, then she looked at me. I held her gaze. He said, "On November 7th, 2 years ago, Caroline called you to tell you she was engaged. She had been wearing that ring for less than 2 hours. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. You told her you were at a spa with Diane and couldn't really talk." My mother's mouth opened slightly. She said, I called her back." Marcus said, "You called her back 6 days later." He turned to the second page. "During the call about the wedding hotel arrangements, 3 weeks before the ceremony, your first question was whether your room was being covered. There was no offer to contribute to any wedding costs, no acknowledgement of the $16,000 Caroline and I spent, no inquiry into whether we needed help with anything." He turned another page. "At the wedding reception, Marcus's cousin Elena overheard you describe the planning process to your table in a way that indicated you had been centrally involved in organizing it. She said, I was talking to people. I didn't mean to." He said, "I know." He said it without any edge. He turned another page. "After we returned from our honeymoon, the frequency of your calls increased." He showed her a chart. He had actually made a simple chart, just a line graph tracking call frequency over time, and the line went up visibly after the honeymoon. He said, over the next 8 months, there were 14 calls. In 9 of them, within the first 15 minutes, there was a request or inquiry about money, financial help, property, or resources. The Tuscany trip was not the first time this came up. It was the first time you stated a specific dollar amount. My mother had stopped making small corrections. She was sitting very still. The bakery box was still on the end table where I had set it. The coffee in front of her was going cold. He turned to the last section. He said, Caroline's engagement call, Carol, the 4-minute call, was the one that started this file, because I was in the room when she made it. I watched her face when you told her you had a spa appointment. And I thought, someone who loves this woman the way she deserves to be loved would want to know that happened. So I started writing it down. Everything. Not to use against you, because documentation is how I make sense of things that don't make sense otherwise. He closed the folder. He said, You didn't come here to see the house or catch up. You came because the phone call didn't work and you wanted to try in person. That's what this is, isn't it? The room was very quiet. Outside I could hear a neighbor's lawnmower, distant and steady. My mother's expression, when it finally settled, was not the expression I had expected. It was not rage. It was not denial. It was something I had seen very rarely on her face in my life. Something that looked almost like the recognition of having been seen clearly, which is a very different thing from being accused, and which is much harder to argue with. She said, I don't know what to say. I said, You don't have to say anything right now. But I want you to understand something. Marcus didn't make that folder to hurt you. He made it because he saw something happening to me over a long time, and he paid attention in the way that someone pays attention when they are actually in your corner. The engagement call, Mom, 4 minutes. I had been wearing the ring for less than 2 hours. She looked at her hands. I said, I'm not sending money for the trip, and I'm not going to keep having this conversation in different forms. If you want a relationship with us, it has to be an actual relationship, not a transaction. She didn't cry. Neither did I. She sat for a few more minutes, and then she picked up her purse, and she said she needed to think. She hugged me at the door, briefly, and it was a different kind of hug from the one when she arrived. Less performance, more something real and uncomfortable. She drove away in the pale spring light, and I stood in the doorway watching the car until it turned the corner. Marcus came up behind me and handed me my coffee cup. He said, You okay? I said, Yes. And I meant it. But the conversation between my mother and Diane about that Saturday did not stay contained. I expected some version of it to reach me, and it did, about a week later, in a text from Diane that said, Mom told me what happened. Are you okay? Which I knew was her way of making an opening without committing to a position, which was the particular Diane move I had watched my whole life. I called her instead of texting back. She answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting for the call, which meant she had not simply received the information passively. She had already processed it and formed a response she was ready to give. She said Mom was really upset. I said, I know. She said she just wanted help with a trip. Caroline. She's not asking for that much. I said it was $9,000, Diane. And before that it was $3,000, and before that it was the hotel room, and before that, I stopped. I said, do you remember the day Marcus proposed? She said, yes. I said, you were at the spa with her. You knew I was nervous about a conversation I was having that morning. You knew. And you went anyway. Diane was quiet. I said, that's the part I keep coming back to. Not that you were there, that you knew. She said, I didn't know it was going to be a proposal. I said, you knew I needed something from you that day, and you chose her instead. You always choose her, and that's your right. But I need you to understand what it costs, because I don't think you've ever really looked at what it costs. She was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, I'm sorry about the spa. I should have been more present. I said, yes, you should have. We didn't end the call in anger. We ended it in something more uncomfortable, which was the kind of honesty that doesn't resolve cleanly and doesn't need to. Diane said she wanted to have lunch sometime. I said maybe. I meant it as maybe, not as yes, and I think she understood that. My mother did not contact me again for 6 weeks. When she did, it was a brief text, a photo of a cardinal at her bird feeder, no context, the kind of message that functions as a test of temperature. I sent back a heart emoji and nothing else. We have not discussed the folder, or the trip, or the engagement call since that Saturday. The conversation happened and it exists, and we are each living in its aftermath differently. Diane and I had lunch 2 months later. She was careful with me in a way she had not been before, more deliberate about not reporting back, more conscious of proximity. Whether that represents change or just adjustment, I am still deciding. I told Marcus about the lunch. He said, good. He didn't say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that would make it either more or less than what it was. My mother did not go to Tuscany. She and Patricia went to a bed and breakfast in Michigan for 4 days in July, which she mentioned in passing in a text, and which I acknowledged with the information of someone who is present, but no longer responsible for filling spaces she chooses to leave. I want to tell you about the morning after she showed up with the bakery box. I woke up early, 5:40 before the alarm, and the bedroom was gray-blue with early light and very quiet. Marcus was asleep beside me. I lay there for a while just listening to him breathe, which I know sounds small, but it isn't, because the presence of a sleeping person who is genuinely on your side is not a small thing. The folder was back in the drawer in the corner desk. The bakery box was on the kitchen counter. I got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the same position I had stood on November 7th, 2.5 years before, holding the mug in both hands while the light came in low and gold. The difference was that this time, I was not trying to reach toward something that wasn't there. The call had happened, the record existed, the conversation had occurred, and I was still standing in my own kitchen, in my own house, with my ring on my finger and my husband sleeping in our room, and my name on our deed and my work on my desk and my life. Mine, genuinely mine, arranged around me in every direction. I drank the coffee. I stood there until the light changed. Then I went back to bed. What I have learned in the time between November 7th and now is something I want to say carefully, because it is easy to simplify, and I don't want to simplify it. I did not stop loving my mother. I do not think she is evil. I think she is a person who learned a particular way of operating in relationships, extracting without reciprocating, centering her own needs with a conviction that reads as entitlement. And I think she learned it over many years, and I think it became automatic in ways she may not always be conscious of. But being unconscious of something is not the same as being innocent of it. The spa appointment was not an accident. The $9,000 ask was not an accident. The 14 calls and 9 requests were not accidents. And the difference, the thing that changed in that living room on that Saturday morning, was not that I became cold or punishing or closed. The difference was that I stopped managing the gap between what she offered and what I needed. I stopped quietly absorbing the shortfall and pretending the account was balanced. Marcus had been watching me do that since the restaurant dinner in Oak Park, and he had been writing it down, Not to build a weapon, but because he understood that things written down are things that can be seen clearly. And when you can see something clearly, you can make an informed choice about what to do with it. I chose to stop pretending. My mother still calls. Not as often, and not with the particular warmth that used to precede a request, because she has learned that the request will be declined in the same neutral tone I have been practicing. We talk about the bird feeder and the weather, and occasionally about Diane's job. We do not talk about Tuscany or the folder or November 7th, but I think of November 7th regularly. I think of the 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and the spa appointment, and the way I stood at the kitchen window holding the mug in both hands, trying to feel something I had permission to feel. I think about how long I waited for something to change on its own, how certain I was that if I was patient enough, if I was good enough, if I asked for less and contributed more, eventually the balance would shift. It doesn't shift. Not like that. The only shift that works is the one you make yourself, on purpose, with evidence in hand, and your name on your own deed, and a person sitting in a chair across from you who has been paying attention since the restaurant dinner and writing things down because he understood, before you fully did, that what was happening to you deserved to be seen. I am 39 years old. I live in a house in Wheaton, Illinois, with my husband, who makes a simple chart when the data warrants it, and who opened a folder on a coffee table on a Saturday morning in May without raising his voice. The backyard has a garden now. I planted it last spring, tomatoes and basil, and one rosebush I have no idea how to care for, but am learning. Marcus grills on Saturday evenings. We have a standing dinner with his cousin Elena and her partner every 6 weeks or so, and Elena has become a genuine friend, the kind who asks how you actually are and waits for the real answer. I spoke to Diane last month. We are in the process of something. Not quite reconciliation, not quite distance. Something more honest than either of those words suggests. She is learning that being close to me is different from being close to our mother, that I will not require her to orbit me, but I will also not absorb impact that belongs to her to own. It's a different kind of closeness, and it requires a different kind of effort. She is making it slowly. I am allowing it slowly. That is where we are. My mother received a card from me on her birthday in March. It was a good card, something warm, something genuine, because I am not interested in performing coldness any more than I was interested in performing accommodation. I called her on the actual day, and we talked for 18 minutes, which is longer than 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and at the end of the call, she said, "I love you," and I said, "I love you too." And both things were true, and both things were also insufficient descriptions of the whole situation. Love does not require you to fund someone's vacation. Love does not require you to absorb what someone takes without giving. Love is a real thing, and it can coexist with limits and documentation and a folder in a corner desk drawer. I have thought about what I would say to someone who is sitting where I was sitting. Not on the morning with the coffee and the ring and the 4-minute call, but in the longer sitting, the years of it, the slow accumulation of small absences and smaller requests, and the growing understanding that what you are dealing with is not an oversight, but a system. If you are that person, here is what I know. The first thing I know is that your perception is correct, the thing you keep noticing and then explaining away. You are right about it. It is not paranoia, and it is not oversensitivity. It is information. The second thing I know is that documentation is not revenge. It is not hostile. It is simply the act of making real what is actually happening, which is something that people who benefit from your uncertainty will always resist, because your clarity is not in their interest. The third thing I know is that setting a limit is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of information giving. You are telling someone where you actually are, instead of performing a location that serves them and costs you. The fourth thing, which is the hardest, you are not required to protect someone from the consequences of their own behavior, especially when that behavior was directed at you, especially when you watched it happen for years and said nothing because you were trying to keep something together that was only held together by your silence. The folder exists. The 4 minutes and 12 seconds exist. The chart exists. The conversation on that Saturday morning in May happened, and it cannot be unhappened, and the ground has not gone back to what it was. That is not a tragedy. That is the most honest thing I have ever allowed to happen in my life. And it happened because I married a man who pays attention and writes things down and opens folders on coffee tables without raising his voice. And because I finally let myself see what was already in front of me. I stood in my kitchen on November 7th holding a coffee mug and the beginning of a new understanding. I stand in my kitchen on most mornings now, still holding a coffee mug, but the understanding is finished, and the house is mine, and the garden is growing, and there is no call I am dreading, and no request I am bracing for, and no gap I am managing quietly so that someone else can be comfortable. That is the whole difference. That is what it costs and what it buys. And I would do it again, exactly the same way, without hesitation. If any part of this story woke something in you, if at any point you thought, I know this feeling, I know this particular kind of absence dressed up as family, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what landed for you. Tell me what you recognized. And if you know someone who is still managing the gap, still absorbing the shortfall, still explaining away the thing they know is real, share this story with them. Because sometimes what you need is not advice. Sometimes you need to see that someone else saw it clearly, documented it, and made a different choice. That it is possible to open the folder and let the truth take up space. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Here we tell stories about people who decided that what they know is worth more than the comfort of pretending they don't know it. A strong hug. And remember, you do not owe anyone silence about what they took from you.